The bread was almost gone. Willa counted the remaining loaves with her eyes, pressing her cracked lips together as the wind cut through the open market stall like a blade without mercy. 3 loaves. 3 small, dense rounds of barley bread that she had shaped before dawn with hands already raw from the cold. 3 loaves between her and another night of watching her younger brother Pip fall asleep with his stomach hollow. The village of Caldermore sat beneath a sky the color of old iron. Snow had not yet fallen, but the air carried its promise. That particular sharpness that settled into the lungs and made breathing feel like swallowing glass. The market square was half empty, which meant the cold had done its usual work of keeping people inside their homes and away from their coin pouches. Willa pulled her wool shawl tighter across her shoulders. It was the color it had been for years, once a deep brown, now something closer to ash, worn thin at the elbows and restitched along the hem more times than she could count. Her boots had been packed with dry grass since autumn to keep out the damp. Her dark copper hair, long and practical, was braided back and tucked beneath a linen coif that had seen better years. She was 23 years old and had been running this bread stall alone for 2 of them, since the fever took her mother. Last of the barley, she murmured to herself, adjusting the cloth that covered the loaves against the chill. Sell all 3 and we eat tonight. Sell 2 and Pip eats. Sell 1. She stopped that thought before it finished itself. The market square of Caldermore was not a place of abundance. It served a village of farmers, woodcutters, weavers, and the occasional traveler passing through on the road that connected the outer territories to the capital. The capital, Veldmore, was 3 days' ride to the north, behind its great stone walls and proud iron gates. Willa had never been there. She had no reason to go, and no coin to make the journey. She had heard stories, of course. Everyone had. The Alpha King ruled from Veldmore. His name was spoken differently depending on who said it. With reverence by the nobles, with fear by the servants, with careful neutrality by anyone who wished to remain alive and comfortable. Some said he had eyes like glacier ice and a voice that could end a man's courage with 3 words. Some said he had not been seen outside the castle walls in over a year. Some said he was grieving. Some said he was planning war. Willa had no opinion on kings. She had bread to sell. The morning dragged. She sold half a loaf to old Renette, the weaver's widow, who counted her copper pieces twice before handing them over with trembling fingers. Willa thanked her warmly and refused to show the weight that settled in her chest as she watched the woman shuffle away into the cold. It was nearly midday when she noticed the man. He was seated at the far edge of the square, against the low stone wall that separated the market from the old chapel courtyard. Not moving, not speaking, just sitting, hunched forward with his elbows on his knees, wearing a traveling cloak so worn and dirty it was difficult to tell its original color. His boots were caked in mud. His hood was drawn forward, shadowing most of his face. A rough, unkempt beard covered his jaw. He had the look of a man who had walked a very long road and had no particular destination in mind. A beggar, she thought, or a traveling laborer between contracts. She watched him for a moment, not with suspicion, but with the quiet, practiced attention of someone who had learned to read people through their posture and stillness. This man was not sleeping. He was watching, but not the market, not the stalls, not the other people moving through the square. He was watching her. The realization did not frighten her. It simply made her curious. She looked down at her remaining loaves. 2.5 now, after Renette. She thought of Pip. Then she thought of the man's stillness. The particular stillness of someone who has gone past hunger into that quiet, dangerous place where the body stops protesting and simply waits. She knew that stillness. She had lived inside it more than once. Willa picked up the smallest remaining piece, a half loaf, misshapen and dense, and walked across the square. The wind followed her, as it always did in Caldermore. She stopped in front of the man. Up close, he was larger than she had realized, broad-shouldered even beneath the worn cloak, with hands that rested on his knees that were scarred along the knuckles. Not the hands of a man born to begging. "You have not moved in 2 hours," she said, not accusing, simply stating. The man lifted his head, and for a moment she caught his eyes beneath the shadow of the hood. They were a pale, unsettling blue, the color of winter sky just before a storm. Not cold exactly, but watchful in a way that made her feel, briefly, as if she were the one being assessed rather than him. "I did not realize I was being observed," he said. His voice was low and even, with an accent she could not quite place. Not local. Not the rough drawl of the Southern Territories either. Something else. "I observe everything in this square," she replied. "It is my livelihood." His gaze dropped to the bread in her hand. "You are offering me that." "I am considering it." "There is a difference." "Yes," she said, "there is." A beat of silence passed between them. He did not reach for it. He did not thank her in advance. He simply waited, with the same patience she had noticed from across the square. She held out the bread. "Half a loaf of barley," she said. "It is dense and plain, but it is warm. I baked it this morning." He took it from her hand. His fingers brushed her palm briefly, cold from the air, but steady. He looked at the bread for a moment before looking back at her. "What is the price?" he asked. "Nothing. Everything has a price." She almost smiled. Not bread given to a hungry man. He studied her with those pale eyes for a long, uncomfortable moment. She held his gaze because she had learned that looking away from difficult things never made them easier. "You are certain you can afford to give this away?" he asked. The question was quiet, but there was something inside it. A sharpness hidden under the simple words, like a knife wrapped in cloth. "No," she said honestly, "but I am doing it anyway." She turned and walked back to her stall. She did not look back at him, because she had made her choice and she was not the kind of person who second-guessed her choices. She had 2 loaves left, and an afternoon to sell them. That was the problem in front of her. Behind her, the man watched her walk away. He had not moved. He had not spoken again. He had simply turned the half-loaf over once in his scarred hands, as though he had forgotten what it felt like to hold something given freely. By the time the market bell rang the 3rd hour of the afternoon, Willa had sold 1 more loaf. The last one sat stubbornly unsold as the square began to empty, the cold winning the day as it always did. She wrapped it carefully in the cloth, tucked it under her arm, and began dismantling her small stall with the practiced efficiency of someone who did this alone every day. When she turned to collect her small wooden board, she found a coin sitting on it. Not a copper, not a silver, a gold piece. She stared at it. In Caldermore, a gold piece was not simply money. It was the kind of thing that passed between lords and merchants, not strangers in market squares. It was more than her stall made in a full week of good weather. She spun around to find the man, but the stone wall at the far edge of the square was empty. He was gone, and the only thing left of him was the weight of that coin in her hand. Warm in a way gold had no right to be in weather this cold, and the memory of pale blue eyes that had looked at her as if she had done something far more significant than give away half a loaf of bread. Willa did not sleep well that night. She lay on the narrow straw pallet she shared with no one. Pip had his own small corner of their 2-room cottage, separated by a hanging curtain of rough linen, and she stared at the ceiling beams while the wind pressed against the shuttered window like something trying to get inside. The gold coin sat on the small shelf above the hearth, catching the last glow of the dying fire. She had turned it over in her fingers a dozen times after supper. It was real. She knew the weight of copper well enough to recognize when something was heavier, denser, more significant. The coin bore a marking she had only seen once before, on a merchant's belt pouch, passing through Caldermore 2 summers ago. A crowned wolf, its head raised, surrounded by a ring of small stars. The Royal Mint. Veldmore. She had told herself it meant nothing. That a traveler might carry royal coin without being anything other than a traveler. that she should simply be grateful and use it wisely. Flour, firewood, a new length of cloth for Pip's coat before the real winter came. But the eyes stayed with her, pale blue and watchful, absorbing everything without giving anything back. She rose before the sun, as she always did. The cottage smelled of cold ash and dried herbs. The bundles of thyme and sage she kept hanging from the low beams more out of her mother's habit than any real need. She dressed quietly, laced her boots, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders twice, and began mixing the morning dough by the light of a single tallow candle. Pip appeared in the doorway of his corner when the bread was already shaped and waiting beside the hearth to prove. He was 14, wiry and sharp-eyed, with the same copper hair as Willa, but worn shorter and always slightly disheveled. He looked at the hearth shelf immediately. "The coin is still there," he said. "Of course it is. Where would it go?" "I don't know." He sat at the small table, pulling his blanket around his shoulders like a cloak. "I thought maybe you dreamed it." "I did not dream it." He was quiet for a moment, watching her move around the small room with the efficiency of someone who had cooked in cramped spaces their entire life. Then, who was he? A traveler. Travelers don't carry royal coin. Some do. Pip gave her a look that was far too knowing for 14. She ignored it and focused on the bread. The market square of Caldermore was even quieter than the day before. A fine, stinging sleet had begun to fall sometime in the night, and had not entirely stopped, leaving the cobblestones slick and the sky the color of wet wool. Only the most determined vendors had set up their stalls, and the few villagers who appeared moved quickly, hunched against the cold, buying what they needed and retreating back to warmth. Willa set up anyway. She always did. She had 4 loaves today. She had used a portion of the gold coin to buy extra barley from the miller before dawn, and the thought of selling out before midday for once was almost enough to make the cold feel manageable. He appeared at the 3rd hour of the morning. He came from the direction of the main road, on foot again, wearing the same worn cloak, the same mud-caked boots. But today his hood was down, and she could see him more clearly. The beard was slightly less unkempt, as though he had made some small effort, and his dark hair was damp from the sleet. He moved through the near-empty square with a deliberate calm, as if weather and circumstance were things that happened to other people. He stopped in front of her stall. "You returned," Willa said. She kept her voice neutral, the way she kept it neutral when she was uncertain about something, and did not want to show it. "I found I had more walking to do in this direction," he said. "Convenient." The ghost of something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. Something more restrained than that. He looked at the loaves arranged on her board. "The same bread as yesterday." "Barley." "Yes, though today I added a little dried rosemary. I had some left." "How much?" 2 copper for a full loaf." He reached into his cloak and produced a copper coin, setting it on the board with the deliberateness of someone who was accustomed to making sure their intentions were clear. Not a gold piece today. A copper, the same as anyone else would pay. She noted that. She was not sure what to do with it yet. She handed him a loaf, wrapped in cloth against the sleet. He took it, and again she had the impression of controlled size, of a man who moved carefully, as though he was always aware of how much space he occupied. "Yesterday's coin was too much," she said. "Yesterday's bread was freely given. Half a loaf of barley is not worth a gold piece." He looked at her steadily. "That is not what I paid for." The sleet ticked against the wooden board between them. Willa felt something shift in the conversation, a weight pressing up beneath the simple words, the way pressure builds beneath ice before it cracks. "Then what did you pay for?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, as though deciding something. "Honesty," he said at last. "It is rarer than gold, in my experience." She had no answer for that. It was not the kind of thing a beggar said, and it confirmed what she had half suspected since the moment she had crossed the square toward him, that whatever this man was, he was not what he appeared. But she did not ask. It was not her nature to press people about what they chose to conceal. Everyone in Caldermore had something they kept quietly folded away from the world's view. She respected that. "Will you be traveling on?" she asked instead, because it was a practical question, and she was a practical woman. "Not immediately." "There is only one inn in Caldermore, Maritz, at the end of the Cooperage Lane. She keeps a clean hearth and does not ask many questions." "A recommendation?" "Information," she said. "The distinction matters." That expression moved across his face again, restrained, private, and this time it reached his eyes briefly before he controlled it. He inclined his head in a small, formal acknowledgement that felt oddly out of place on a man in a beggar's cloak. "Thank you, Willa," he said. She went still. She had not told him her name. He was already walking away, the loaf tucked under one arm, moving through the sleet with that same unhurried calm. He did not look back. Willa stood at her stall and felt the cold differently for a moment, not as the usual dull burden of the season, but as something sharp and present, pressing against her skin. He knew her name. She mentioned it to no one. Not to Pip, who would ask too many questions. Not to Renette, who would spread it through every household in the village by nightfall. She carried it quietly through the rest of the day, letting the ordinary rhythm of the market push it to the edges of her mind, counting coin, wrapping bread, exchanging the small, careful courtesies of marketplace life. But it stayed there, at the edges. It was Bram who noticed something was different. Bram was the blacksmith's son, 26 years old, broad as a doorframe, with honest hands and an earnest manner that had always made Willa feel both fond of him and faintly guilty for the fondness not being more than it was. He stopped at her stall in the late afternoon, as she was packing up, carrying a cloth-wrapped bundle that turned out to be a small portion of roasted turnip from his mother's kitchen. "Thought you might not have had a proper midday," he said, setting it on the board. "You thought correctly," she admitted, and meant the gratitude in her voice. "Thank you, Bram." He leaned against the stall post with his arms crossed, watching her pack. "The stranger's been at Maretz," he said, in the careful way he delivered information he thought might matter. "Arrived this morning, paid in advance. 3 days." Willa kept her hands moving, folding the cloth over the board. "Many travelers stop at Maretz. Not many who look like that and pay like that," Bram said. His voice was still easy, still friendly, but she heard the thing underneath it, the particular wariness of a man who had appointed himself, quietly and without being asked, as something like a protector. She looked at him. He was watching her with a careful expression. "You spoke to him?" she asked. "Tried. He's not a man who encourages conversation." "No," she agreed. "He is not." Bram was quiet for a moment. "Willa, do you know who he is?" "No." It was the truth. She did not know who he was. But standing there in the cold, with the turnip still warm through the cloth and the sound of the sleet beginning again on the empty stallboards, she was beginning to understand that whoever he was, the answer to that question was going to change something. She could feel it the way her mother had always said she could feel weather coming. Not in her bones, but somewhere deeper, in the quiet space behind her sternum where instinct lived. Something was already shifting. She just did not know yet in which direction it would fall. The frost came properly on the 3rd day. Willa woke to find the inside of the cottage window glazed with a thin skin of ice, the kind that meant the temperature had dropped sharply in the night and intended to stay there. The water in the clay pitcher beside the hearth had a crust at the top. Her breath made small white clouds in the dim light before she got the fire going again. She worked quickly, as she always did in the mornings, coaxing the coals back to life, setting the pot to heat, checking the flour supply with the automatic inventory of someone who had learned that complacency about provisions was a luxury she could not afford. The gold coin had stretched further than she had let herself hope. There was enough barley for 4 more days of baking, enough dried peas for 2 decent meals, enough firewood stacked against the outside wall to last the week if she was careful. Careful was something she had always been good at. Pip appeared, as always, drawn by the smell of the fire returning to life. He sat at the table wrapped in his blanket and watched her with sharp eyes over the rim of the clay cup she handed him. Hot water with a bruised sprig of dried mint, because they had no tea, and mint was what grew wild along the cottage's east wall. "Bram stopped by yesterday evening," he said, "while you were putting away the stall board." "I know, I saw him. He's worried about the stranger." "Bram worries about everything that might affect this village." She kept her voice even. "It is one of his better qualities." Pip turned the cup slowly in his hands. "What do you think about the stranger?" Willa looked at her brother for a moment. He was 14, but grief had sharpened him early. The kind of early that skipped childhood's ease and went straight to something more careful and attentive. She did not want to be careless with him. "I think he is someone important traveling as someone ordinary," she said, "and I think his reasons are his own. That doesn't worry you?" "Many things worry me, Pip. I choose which ones to act on." He considered this with the serious expression he wore when he was deciding whether to accept an answer or push further. Today, he accepted it. The market was sparse again. The frost had done what the sleet had threatened to do, reducing the square to a handful of stalls and a scattering of villagers moving purposefully between them. Willa sat up in her usual spot and pulled her shawl tighter and waited. He arrived later than the previous days. Late enough that she had begun, without admitting it to herself, to look toward the entrance of the Cooperage Lane whenever movement caught her eye. When he finally appeared, he was not alone. Behind him, at a distance that might have seemed coincidental to someone who was not paying attention, walked two men. They were dressed as travelers, rough cloaks, road-worn boots, but they moved with the particular economy of trained fighters. Willa noticed the way they scanned the square without appearing to, the way they positioned themselves without seeming to choose their positions. Guards. Concealed ones. But guards nonetheless. She said nothing when he reached her stall. He bought bread again. Copper coin again. He stood a moment longer than strictly necessary after the transaction was complete, looking at the remaining loaves with an expression that was almost meditative. "The rosemary is finished," she said, because silence with this man felt like a thing that needed managing. "I noticed." He looked up. "It was good. My mother's addition. I kept the habit." Something moved in his expression at that. Brief and quickly contained, but she caught it. A recognition of something. Loss recognizing loss, perhaps. "She's gone?" he asked. 2 years passed. A fever. She held his gaze. "And yours?" The question surprised him. She saw that clearly. The slight arrest in his stillness, the fractional pause before he answered. "Also gone," he said. "Long ago." "I am sorry for it." "As am I," he said quietly. And it did not sound like the automatic courtesy of a man saying the expected thing. It sounded like the truth, carried for a long time in a place where it had not been set down in a while. They stood for a moment in the ordinary noise of the market around them. The distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer, a child's voice somewhere, the creak of cartwheels on cold stone. "You know my name," Willa said. She had decided to say it plainly, the way she preferred to approach things that might otherwise become complicated with delay. "I did not tell it to you." He did not look away. "No, you did not. Then you learned it some other way." "I asked," he said. "In the village. Before I came to your stall the first morning." "Why?" A pause. "Because I wanted to know the name of the woman who crossed a market square in the cold to feed a stranger." It was not an answer that opened anything further. It was precisely calibrated, honest enough to acknowledge the question, contained enough to reveal nothing more than he intended. She recognized the skill in it the way she recognized skilled craftsmanship in other things, by its clean edges. "My name is Valen," he said. She had not asked. The offering of it felt significant. "Valen," she repeated, testing the weight of it. A single syllable, clean and spare. Nothing elaborate. He nodded once, as though they had reached some small agreement. It was that evening, after the market, that things shifted. She was walking home through the narrow lane behind the cooperage, the empty board under one arm and the day's earnings in the small leather pouch at her belt, when she heard the voices. Two of them, men, low and deliberate, coming from the shadow of the cooper's yard wall. She recognized one of the voices. Aldrich, the village reeve's eldest son. A man of 28 who had inherited his father's administrative position and his father's conviction that the village existed primarily for his own convenience. She did not recognize the second voice. Seen asking questions about the woman, the second voice was saying. The bread seller. She's no one, Aldrich's voice. Dismissive, the way he was dismissive about most things. A widow's orphan with a stall and a brother to feed. What interest could a man like that have in her? That is precisely what concerns me, the second voice said. It was quiet and clipped, with the same unplaceable accent she had noticed in Valen's speech. But where Valen's voice carried an even restraint, this voice had a cold quality underneath it. The particular coldness of someone who dealt in problems by making them disappear. He is not what he presents himself to be, and if he is here, there is a reason. You are certain it is him? A pause. The eyes, the second voice said. There is no mistaking them. The question is what we do before he decides to stop pretending. Willa pressed herself against the cottage wall and breathed carefully through her nose. The cold stone bit through her shawl. She did not move. If it becomes a problem, Aldrich said slowly, the woman could be useful. People do reckless things when someone they care about is threatened. The second voice was quiet for a moment. An interesting thought. Let us see how attached he becomes first. Footsteps. Moving away, down the far side of the yard. Willa waited until the sound was gone entirely, before she straightened and walked the rest of the way home. Her hands were steady. Her heartbeat was not. She set the board against the cottage wall, hung her shawl on the peg behind the door, and sat down at the table in the dark for a long moment before she lit the candle. Pip was at a neighbor's, helping split wood for the widow Renette in exchange for a meal, a small arrangement they had made for evenings when the market ran long. She was alone. She sat with the candle and turned over what she had heard with the same methodical attention she gave to difficult problems. Piece by piece, in order, a man named Valen, traveling as a beggar, with hidden guards. Someone who knew him, who feared what his presence meant. An alliance between that someone and Aldrich, the reeve's son, who had always moved through Caldermore as though the village owed him something it had not yet paid. And her own name, spoken in the dark by men who had not said it kindly. She thought of pale blue eyes assessing her across a market square. She thought of a gold coin warm in her cold hand. She thought of what the hidden voice had said. There is no mistaking them. And the weight behind those words. The weight of recognition, of history, of something much larger than a village market in the frost. She did not know what Valen was, but she was beginning to understand that knowing might no longer be something she could choose to defer, because it seemed the choice was being made for her, in dark yards, by men with cold voices and calculations she had not yet fully seen. She pressed her palms flat against the table and made herself breathe evenly. Tomorrow she would open her stall. Tomorrow she would sell bread. And tomorrow, for the first time, she would look at the man who called himself Valen and ask herself not who he appeared to be, but what he was truly doing in Caldermore, and why the answer to that question had begun to feel like something sharp and unavoidable, pressing up through the ordinary frost of her ordinary life like a blade through ice. She did not sleep again, not properly. She drifted in and out of a restless half-consciousness, the candle burning down to a stub on the table where she had forgotten to move it, the fire reduced to quiet embers that painted the ceiling in faint amber. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard the voice from the cooper's yard, cold and precise, speaking her name like a piece on a game board being considered for sacrifice. When dawn came, she rose, washed her face with the water from the pitcher, and made a decision. She would not wait. Marit's Inn sat at the end of Cooperage Lane, a low-roofed building of old stone and dark timber, with a sign above the door bearing a faded painted fox. It was the kind of place that smelled permanently of wood smoke, tallow candles, and the particular sourness of ale absorbed into old floorboards over decades. Willa had been inside twice in her life. Once as a child with her mother, once 2 years ago when she needed to ask Maret about a debt her mother had left behind. She arrived before the market bell rang the first hour, when the lane was still empty, and the frost on the cobblestones had not yet been disturbed by foot traffic. Marit herself answered the door, a heavy-set woman of 50, with iron-gray hair pinned severely back, and eyes that had catalogued and filed away every person who had ever passed through her threshold. She looked at Willa with mild surprise and the careful neutrality of a woman who had learned not to show curiosity too openly. "He is in the back room," Maret said, before Willa had spoken a word. Willa looked at her. "He said someone might come early," Maret added, with the tone of a person who had decided the simplest approach was the most honest one. "He said to let her through if she did. He had anticipated her. That should have irritated her. Instead, it settled something. The recognition that she was not, in fact, being reckless. That whatever was happening, she was not the only one who had been thinking through the night. Marit led her through the common room, past the cold hearth and the empty tables, to a narrow door at the back. She knocked twice and stepped aside without a word. "Come in," said Valen's voice from within. The back room was small and plainly furnished. A table, 2 chairs, a hearth that had been burning long enough to have made the room genuinely warm. A traveling pack sat against the far wall, closed and unremarkable. A cup of something steaming sat on the table. Valen stood when she entered. He was not wearing the beggar's cloak. He wore a dark tunic of good wool, simply cut but well made, in a way that declared quality without ornamentation. A leather vest over it, worn but well kept, with no insignia she could identify in the dim light. His dark hair was pushed back from his face. He looked different without the hood, larger somehow, and more carefully contained. More like a man deliberately making himself smaller than his actual size. He looked at her, and something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of recognition that went beyond simple acknowledgement. "You heard something," he said. It was not a question. "Last evening, behind the copperage." She sat in the chair across from him without waiting to be asked, because she was not going to stand in the presence of a man she needed to speak to honestly. 2 men speaking in the dark. One of them was Aldrich, the Reeves' son. The other I did not recognize. "He had your accent." Valen was very still. "What did they say?" His voice was even, but she heard something beneath it. A focused attention that made the air in the small room feel slightly different. She told him. All of it. Precisely as she had heard it, without embellishment or omission. When she finished, the silence lasted long enough that the fire crackled twice into it. "They spoke your name," he said finally. "Yes." He looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked back at her, and something in his expression changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that would have been visible to someone who had not been watching him carefully for 3 days. But she had been watching him carefully. The careful performance of ordinariness was gone. What remained was something quieter and more genuine, and somehow considerably more formidable. "Willa," he said, "I owe you an honest answer." "You owe me several," she said, "but one will do to start." The ghost of that restrained expression crossed his face, the one she had begun to recognize as the closest he came to something like warmth. He reached into the leather vest and withdrew something small. He set it on the table between them. A ring, heavy gold, set with a dark blue stone. And on the band, pressed in relief, unmistakable even in the dim firelight, a crowned wolf, its head raised, surrounded by a ring of small stars, the same mark as the coin on her shelf at home. She looked at the ring. Then she looked at him. "You are the Alpha King," she said. Not a question. Not an accusation. Simply the naming of a thing that had been present in the room without being spoken. "Yes," he said. The fire crackled again. Outside, somewhere distant, a cartwheel groaned on the frost-hardened lane. Willa breathed carefully. She was aware of the impulse to feel overwhelmed by this information, and she was equally aware that yielding to that impulse would not serve her. So she set it aside with the same practiced efficiency she applied to problems that were large, but required immediate practical attention. "The man behind the cooperage," she said. "He knew you. His name is Soren. He served on my council until 8 months ago, when I removed him for conduct I will not detail, but which was sufficient to warrant removal." Valen's voice was flat and precise. "He has been positioning himself in the outer territories since then, building alliances, looking for leverage. And Aldrich. A local instrument. A man who resents his station and would welcome a patron with ambitions larger than a village reeve's office." He paused. "I did not know Soren had tracked me here. I came to Caldermore alone, or I believed I was alone, to understand what the outer territories needed from the crown, without the distortion of intermediaries and formal visits." His pale eyes were steady on hers. "What I found was not what I expected." "Bread," she said dryly. "Honesty," he said. The same word he had used at the market stall. Something I had not encountered in some time, in its genuine form. When every person around you knows who you are, nothing they say to you is uncalculated. She absorbed this. Then, "How many people know you are here?" "My 2 guards. Marit, who recognized me and has kept my confidence. And now me. And now you." He held her gaze. "Which creates a difficulty, because Soren has placed your name in his calculations." "I gathered that." "I will not allow harm to come to you because of proximity to me," he said. And it was not the grand declaration of a king. It was something quieter than that, and more personal, spoken in the tone of a man who was making a commitment rather than a speech. Willa looked at him for a long moment. "That is admirable," she said, "but I would prefer to be part of the solution rather than simply the protected problem. I know this village. I know Aldrich and his habits. I know which doors in Caldermore are left unlocked, and which ears listen from behind them." Something shifted in his expression, an attention that went beyond assessment into something that looked, briefly, almost like relief. "You are not afraid," he said. "I am frightened," she corrected him, with precision. "Those are different things. Fear is information. I am using it." He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the deliberateness of someone making a decision he had been considering for longer than this conversation. "Then help me." It was Bram who gave her the first piece. She found him at the smithy when she returned from Maret's, and she told him only what she needed to. That Aldrich was involved with someone dangerous, that she needed to know Aldrich's movements over the past week, and that he should trust her reasons without requiring all of them yet. Bram looked at her for a long time with that careful expression she knew well. Then he nodded. "He's been meeting someone at the old granary on the East Road," Bram said. "After dark. 3 times this week that I know of." He paused. "Willa, are you safe?" "I intend to be," she said. He caught her arm gently as she turned to leave. "Whatever this is, you don't have to carry it alone." She looked at his honest face, at the worry in it, and felt the particular ache of being genuinely cared for by someone you could not fully protect with honesty. "I know," she said. "Thank you, Bram." She walked back to her cottage, lit the fire, and looked at the gold coin still sitting on the shelf above the hearth. In a few hours she would open her stall. She would sell bread and count copper and wrap loaves in cloth against the cold, exactly as she did every day. But underneath all of it, something had irrevocably changed. She was no longer simply surviving the winter. She was inside something much larger than a market square in frost. And the man with pale blue eyes and a crowned wolf on his ring was counting on her knowledge of this village, on her honesty, on her courage, on the same quality that had sent her across a cold square with half a loaf of bread, to do something she had never been asked to do before. Help a king. She pressed her palms flat against the shelf and steadied herself. Then she turned and began to prepare. The old granary on the East Road had not stored grain in 3 winters. It sat at the edge of Caldermore like something the village had quietly agreed to forget. Walls of old stone darkened by weather. The roof partially collapsed at the eastern corner. The wide doors warped on their hinges and permanently half open. Children avoided it because someone had started a rumor years ago that a wolf had denned there one winter and never fully left. Adults avoided it because it was easier to ignore things that had outlived their usefulness. It made, Willa thought, an ideal place for men conducting conversations they did not want remembered. She arrived before dark. She had told Pip she was visiting Renette to bring the widow her weekly portion of bread, a kindness she performed genuinely most weeks, which made the lie feel worse than it might have otherwise. She had brought a real loaf for Renette on her way, delivered it with a brief warm exchange at the widow's door, and then taken the longer path around the village's eastern edge rather than returning home. The frozen grass crunched softly beneath her boots. The sky had gone the deep gray purple of a winter evening, the light draining away from the east first, leaving the tree line as a black border against the fading sky. Her breath made pale shapes in the cold air. She moved carefully, staying close to the tree line where the shadows were deepest. She found a place at the granary's north wall, where a section of stone had crumbled to half its original height, low enough to crouch behind, with a gap between the remaining stones that gave her a clean sightline through the interior of the building, where torchlight flickered. She had been there perhaps a quarter of an hour when the voices began. Aldrich she recognized easily. Tall, fair-haired, always dressed slightly above his station in clothes that announced ambition more clearly than he perhaps intended. He stood with his arms crossed and his weight shifted back on his heels, the posture of a man trying to look more comfortable than he was. Soren she saw clearly for the first time. He was older than she had imagined from his voice, perhaps 50, lean in the way of someone who had once been broader and had shed the weight of easier years. His hair was iron gray, cropped close. He wore a traveling cloak of deep charcoal with a fur-lined collar, and his hands, folded before him, were very still in the way that Valen's hands were still. But where Valen's stillness felt like restraint, Soren's felt like calculation. "He has not moved against us," Aldrich was saying, with the slightly querulous edge of a man who had expected something to have happened by now. 3 days and nothing. "He is gathering information," Soren said. His voice was exactly as she had heard it in the dark, clipped and cold, each word placed with the deliberateness of a mason setting stones. "That is what he does. He watches. He listens. He understands a situation completely before he acts." A pause. "It is what makes him dangerous. Then we should move first." "We will." Soren turned slightly, and the torchlight caught the side of his face, a sharp jaw, deep-set eyes that reflected the flame without warmth. But not with haste. Haste is how capable men become dead men. "The woman," Aldrich began, "will be useful when the time comes. He has been at her stall every morning. That is not accident or coincidence, with a man like him." Soren's voice dropped. "She is leverage, but she is also a risk if she becomes aware of her position before we are ready." Willa kept very still behind the crumbled wall. "What do you want from him?" Aldrich asked. "Ultimately, what does this achieve for you?" A silence, long enough that the torchlight swayed in a draft from the broken roof. "He removed me from the council on the grounds of conduct unbecoming," Soren said. "He stripped rank, title, and holdings. He did it publicly, in the Great Hall, in front of every noble and advisor who had ever watched me work." The coldness in his voice acquired something beneath it. Not heat exactly, but a compressed, pressurized quality, like a feeling that had been refined over months into something harder and more durable than anger. I want restoration. I want what was taken returned. And I want him to understand that he cannot move against men of my position without consequence. And if he refuses? Kings who disappear in the outer territories are occasionally presumed to have met with misfortune, Soren said. These are wild lands. Accidents occur. The cold that moved through Willa then had nothing to do with the winter air. She stayed motionless until both men extinguished the torch and left through the main doors, their footsteps retreating toward the village. She counted slowly to 100 before she rose from behind the wall, her knees stiff from the cold and the crouching, and made her way back through the frozen dark. Valen was in Moret's back room when she arrived, one of his concealed guards, a compact, watchful man named Edric, standing at the corridor entrance. Edric looked at her and then at Valen, and Valen nodded once, and the guard stepped aside. She told him everything, precisely and in order, the way she had the first time, without embellishment. When she described Soren's final words, she watched Valen's face and saw nothing change in it except a slight deepening of the stillness, the way water goes very quiet just before something moves beneath the surface. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. He wants to be restored, Valen said finally. Not a question. Processing it. That is what he said. What he was removed for, Valen said slowly, was the falsification of tax records in 3 outer territories. He had been collecting levies from the villages in his administrative territory and recording half of what he collected. The other half went to accounts I discovered only when a farmer from a village near the border brought me a receipt that did not match the Crown's records. He paused. He impoverished people who had little enough already. Willa thought of counted copper coins, of 3 loaves of barley bread, of Pip's cup of mint water in the morning because they had no tea. Then his removal was just, she said. Yes. And he knows that. Men like Soren, Valen said carefully, do not evaluate actions by justice. They evaluate them by outcome. He lost something he wanted. The reason is, to him, secondary. He stood then, moving to the small window that looked out on the dark lane. His back was to her for a moment, and she looked at the line of his shoulders, the particular tension of a man carrying something heavy and privately. I should not have put you in this position, he said without turning. You did not put me in it. Soren did. The moment he and Aldrich decided I was useful. She kept her voice even. The question is what we do now. He turned back to her. In the firelight, his eyes were very pale, and she saw in them something she had not expected. Not the calculation of a king managing a threat, but something rawer than that. Something that looked like the weight of responsibility felt genuinely, rather than performed. I have sent word to my guard captain through Edric, he said. A company of Crown soldiers will reach Caldermore in 2 days' time. Until then, I need Soren to believe nothing has changed. He will watch me, Willa said. If I behave differently, he will know something shifted. Yes. Then I open my stall tomorrow. I sell bread. I give nothing away in my face or my manner. She met his gaze. And you come to buy bread at the 3rd hour, as you have done every morning. Something moved in his expression. You would do that, he said. Continue as though you heard nothing, knowing the risk. I have been managing risk since I was 17 years old, she said. It is not a new skill. He looked at her for a long moment. That particular quality of attention she had felt from the first day, but without the concealment now. No performance of a beggar's passivity, just a man looking at another person and seeing them with a clarity that was, in its own way, more intimate than most things she had experienced. Why? He asked quietly. You owe me nothing. You owe the Crown nothing. You could take your brother and leave Caldermore tonight and have a defensible reason for it. She considered the question seriously, the way she considered all serious questions. Because Soren's records show that outer territory villages have been paying double levies for years, she said. because the farmer who brought you that receipt could have been anyone in Caldermore. Because the widow Renette counts her copper twice before she hands it over, and I think she has been doing that for reasons that are not simply old age. She held his gaze. And because you gave a hungry man a half a loaf of bread and were genuinely thanked for it. Not because you were supposed to, but because it was the right thing in front of you. Valen was very quiet. I am not a grand person, Willa continued more quietly. I make bread. I keep my brother fed. I try to be honest and useful in whatever small way is available to me. But being useful in a small way, and being useful in a larger one when the opportunity arrives, those are the same principle. She paused. My mother taught me that. He looked at the table for a moment. When he looked back at her, something in his face had shifted. Something that had been held carefully in place for a long time had eased. Just slightly, in the way a fist slowly opens. Your mother, he said, was clearly a remarkable woman. She was ordinary, Willa said. She was simply consistent. He nodded slowly. The firelight was warm between them in the small room, and outside, the frost was deepening on the lane, and somewhere across the village, Soren was in a cold building counting his plans like coins he believed were safely hidden. But in this room, something had been decided. Not dramatically, not with ceremony. Simply and finally, and with the quiet certainty of two people who had independently arrived at the same understanding of what mattered and why. Tomorrow she would open her stall, and 2 days from now, everything in Caldermore would change. The crown soldiers arrived at dawn on the second day, as Valen had promised. Willa heard them before she saw them. The steady rhythm of hooves on the frost-hardened road, the particular disciplined sound of horses moving in formation, rather than the irregular clatter of travelers. She was at her stall when they entered the square, 12 riders in dark cloaks bearing the crowned wolf crest, and she watched the village of Caldermore go very still around her, the way small places go still when something large and undeniable enters them. Soren was arrested at Maret's Inn before the morning bell rang the second hour. He had been there since the previous evening. She learned later. Waiting, Edric told her quietly, for a message from Aldrich that never came, because Aldrich had seen the soldiers enter the village gate and had made the particular calculation of a man who had always valued his own survival over his commitments. It did not save him. Valen's guards found Aldrich at his father's house before midday, still in his sleeping clothes, with the expression of a man who had convinced himself, until the very last moment, that things might resolve themselves in his favor. They did not. Willa sold bread through all of it. She kept her stall open because it was what she did, and because closing it would have felt like yielding to the disruption. And she had not survived 2 years of market days in every weather by yielding to disruption. Old Renette came and bought her usual half-portion. The blacksmith's wife came and bought 2 loaves. 3 other villagers, drawn partly by hunger and partly by the irresistible human need to be near the center of events, bought the remaining stock before midday. She sold out completely for the first time in a week. When the square had calmed and the soldiers had taken their prisoners toward the east road, and the village had begun the slow, murmuring process of absorbing what had happened, Valen came to her stall. He was not wearing the beggar's cloak. He wore the dark tunic she had seen at Maret's, and over it now, a traveling cloak of deep charcoal. Not a king's formal regalia, but something between the disguise and the full declaration. A middle ground chosen deliberately. His guards stood at a distance, visible now, not concealing themselves. The stallboard was empty. She had nothing left to sell. I appear to have missed the bread, he said. You should have come earlier. I was occupied. I noticed. He looked at the empty board, and then at her. The pale blue eyes were the same as they had been on the first morning, watchful, absorbing. But the careful performance of ordinariness was entirely gone now, and what remained was simply him. A man who was also a king, standing at an empty bread stall in the winter sun. Soren will face a crown tribunal, he said. Aldrich as well. The records from the outer territories will be reviewed. The levies that were falsified. He paused. They will be corrected. What was taken will be returned where it can be traced. Willa thought of Renette counting her copper coins. Good, she said simply. He reached into his cloak. For a moment she thought he was going to produce another gold coin, and she was already preparing the precise words with which she intended to refuse it. But what he said on the empty board was not a coin. It was a small piece of folded parchment, sealed with dark wax bearing the crowned wolf mark. She looked at it without touching it. What is this? A formal letter, he said, designating the Caldermore market stall held by Willa, daughter of Marin, as a provisioner under Crown record. It means the stall cannot be taxed above the standard rate, cannot be seized for debt without Crown review, and is recognized as a legitimate trade enterprise in the Outer Territories. He held her gaze. It is practical, not dramatic. I thought you would prefer it that way. She stared at him. Then she looked at the parchment, then back at him. You did this last night, she said, while everything else was happening. Edric has good handwriting, he said, and I know my own seal. She picked up the parchment carefully. It was real, heavy, official, the wax seal precise and unmistakable. She held it for a moment, feeling the particular weight of something that would make a genuine difference to two people trying to survive a winter on barley bread and dried mint tea. Her throat did something she did not entirely approve of. Thank you, she said, quietly, and with the full weight of meaning behind it. He nodded. Then, with the deliberateness she had come to recognize as the way he approached things that mattered to him, I will be returning to Veldmore tomorrow. I expected that. The Outer Territories require a proper administrative review. Someone who understands what these villages actually need, rather than what intermediaries report they need. A pause. I find I have been insufficiently informed about the lives of people who are not in my immediate proximity. Half a loaf of bread will do that to a person, she said. That expression crossed his face. The restrained one, the one that reached his eyes. And this time he did not control it entirely. Willa. He said her name the way he had said it from the beginning, with a weight that had always felt like more than simple identification. I would like to return to Caldermore, when the review brings me to the Outer Territories, which it will, within the month. She looked at him for a long moment. The winter sun was thin and pale above the square. The frost was still on the cobblestones in the shadowed corners. Somewhere behind her, Bram's hammer had resumed its steady rhythm at the smithy. The ordinary, reliable sound of the village continuing its life. The stall will be here, she said. And if you come at the third hour, the bread will still be warm. He held her gaze for one long, quiet moment. Then he inclined his head, that small, formal gesture she had noticed the very first day, which she understood now was not the habit of a traveler, but the instinct of a man who had spent his life acknowledging things of genuine significance. He turned and walked toward the east road, his guards falling into place at a respectful distance. Willa watched him go. She stood at her empty stall in the thin winter sun, the sealed parchment in her hand, and felt something she had not felt in a long time. Not the precarious lightness of a problem temporarily resolved, but something sturdier. Something that had foundations. Pip appeared at her elbow, slightly out of breath, having clearly run from somewhere. Was that? He started. Yes. The Alpha King. Yes. He stared at the east road for a moment, then at her, then at the parchment in her hand. Are we going to be all right? He asked. The question was 14 years old and entirely genuine. Willa looked at the parchment, at the crowned wolf pressed into the dark wax, at the winter sun on the empty board, where tomorrow there would be bread again. Yes, she said. We are going to be all right. And she meant it, not as reassurance, not as a thing said to hold worry at bay, but as a fact she could feel the weight of, solid and real in her hands, like bread still warm from the oven. Bram's hammer rang steadily from the smithy. Old Renette's shutters opened to let in the morning air. The village of Caldermore breathed and moved and continued as villages do. And Willa folded the parchment carefully, tucked it inside her shawl against her heart, and began to pack away her stall for the day. Tomorrow, she would be here. Tomorrow she would bake before dawn, shape the loaves with careful hands, carry them through the cold to the square, and set them on the board in the thin winter light. And sometime in the weeks ahead, a man with pale blue eyes and a crowned wolf on his ring would return to Caldermore, not in disguise, not testing anything, not concealed beneath a worn cloak and careful stillness, but simply as himself. And she would hand him a warm loaf across the board, and he would pay the fair price for it, and whatever came next would come next. That was enough. That was more than enough. For now the bread was sold, the cold was manageable, her brother was beside her, and the day was done. It was, Willa thought, a very good place to begin.